This was one of the last known photos taken of rapper XXXTentacion, moments before he was fatally shot during a robbery outside a Florida motorcycle dealership in June of 2018. Investigators determined it was not a targeted hit job, but a robbery gone wrong after suspects spotted his luxury vehicle and expensive Louis Vuitton bag. Released surveillance footage showed two gunmen approaching his car, demanding the bag and opening fire when he resisted. The 20-year-old artist, born Jase Onfroy, was shot multiple times at close range and died shortly after at a nearby hospital. In 2023, 3 men were convicted of his first-degree murder and armed robbery. Beatrice Flamini spent 500 days completely alone inside a cave nearly 230 feet underground, cut off from sunlight, clocks, and all human contact as part of an experiment on extreme isolation. She entered the cave in November of 2021 and did not emerge until April of 2023, with no communication with the outside world during that time. Scientists monitoring her remotely had found that her circadian rhythm had completely collapsed, with severe sleep disruption, memory lapses, and slowed cognition developing over time. Flamini later described moments of mental detachment and sensory distortion, and when she finally resurfaced, she genuinely believed she'd only been underground for about 160 days, illustrating how prolonged isolation can fundamentally fracture the brain's sense of time and reality. Brendan Fraser's brief collapse was driven by years of physical destruction, psychological breakdown, and what many believe was a Hollywood blacklist. At the height of his career, he was performing nearly all of his own stunts, which led to multiple herniated discs, spinal compression, a fractured pelvis, and repeated surgeries that left him in constant pain. In 1999, Fraser nearly died during the filming of The Mummy when a hanging stunt went horribly wrong and the rope was pulled too tightly, cutting off blood flow to his brain and causing him to lose consciousness. He later said doctors told him he came dangerously close to serious brain injury or death. Around the same time, he endured the passing of his mother, a financially devastating divorce, and severe depression. Brendan later alleged he was sexually assaulted by a powerful Hollywood executive in 2003, and after speaking about it privately, his career abruptly stalled. Many believe he was quietly blacklisted as major roles vanished almost overnight, leaving him to describe himself as invisible for years while living in pain and isolation. After roughly a 15-year hiatus, Fraser ultimately rebuilt his life and career, returning to Hollywood on his own terms and finding renewed stability and appreciation from fans. July of 2025, 43-year-old Clinton Brink and his wife Kristen were hiking with their 2 young daughters, ages 7 and 9, at Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas when they were suddenly attacked on a remote trail by a stranger armed with a knife. Witnesses later described the man as having an unsettling death stare before he suddenly launched the assault without warning or provocation. Clinton immediately fought off the attacker to buy time for his family to escape, while Kristen ran the girls to safety and then returned to help her husband. Both parents were fatally stabbed during the struggle. The children were later found uninjured about a half a mile away, having been protected by their parents' final acts of bravery. A 5-day multi-state manhunt later ensued after investigators discovered blood at the scene that didn't belong to either victim. The suspect, 28-year-old teacher Andrew James McGann, was eventually located and arrested at a barbershop in Springdale, Arkansas, where he was in the middle of getting a haircut to alter his appearance. At the height of her Disney fame, Ashley Tisdale was battling serious health and mental struggles. Since childhood, she had suffered from severe anxiety and panic attacks, and during her High School Musical years, they became so intense that she was repeatedly rushed to hospitals believing she was having heart attacks until doctors realized it was panic. The stress left her barely eating and constantly exhausted. In 2007, at 21 years old, months of unexplained pain led doctors to discover a tumor in her breast that required surgery, later confirmed to be benign. Years later, she revealed she developed alopecia, causing patches of her hair to fall out from stress and autoimmune issues, saying the pressure to appear fine through the years came at a real cost to her health. In January of 2026 in Pennsylvania, 11-year-old Clayton Dietz fatally shot his adoptive father, Douglas Dietz, on the night of the boy's own birthday after his Nintendo Switch was taken away from him. Police say the child waited until his father fell asleep on the couch, found the key to his gun safe, loaded a handgun, and shot him once in the head. The boy later admitted he did it out of anger over losing his game console. Douglas Dietz died at the scene, while prosecutors charged the boy with criminal homicide and moved to try him as an adult, calling the case one of the most disturbing juvenile killings in recent years. In Flint, Michigan in 1978, 14-month-old Keith Edmonds was crying in his crib when his mother's boyfriend lost control and forced the baby's face against a red-hot electric heater. The metal burned so deeply that half of Keith's face suffered third-degree burns. Doctors said the damage destroyed one eye, severely injured the other, and left his face permanently disfigured. He underwent years of surgeries, skin grafts, and hospital treatment just to survive. The attacker was convicted of severe child abuse and sentenced to 10 years in prison, while Keith spent most of his childhood in hospitals and foster care before eventually reuniting with his mother. Haunted by the trauma, he later struggled with addiction into adulthood but managed to turn his life around at age 35. In 2016, he founded the Keith Edmonds Foundation, which now helps abused and neglected children through various programs. Chef Anthony Bourdain often described his life as something he wasn't supposed to still have. In the 1980s, while working as a chef in New York City, he fell into a severe heroin addiction, using daily, stealing from coworkers, and living in a constant state of physical and mental collapse. He later admitted he fully expected to die young during that period and was surprised he survived it at all. When fame arrived years later after writing Kitchen Confidential, Bourdain said that sudden success in many ways was more dangerous than addiction, giving him money, access, and non-stop travel that nearly pulled him back into self-destructive behavior. While filming No Reservations and Parts Unknown, he spent years moving through regions marked by executions, cartel violence, and war, repeatedly confronting death up close until he said it began to feel disturbingly ordinary. Even as his career thrived, Bourdain acknowledged that depression never truly left him, describing it as something that doesn't disappear but waits in the shadows, a statement that would take on a far darker meaning after he took his own life in 2018. In 1985, talk show host Richard Belzer invited Hulk Hogan and Mr. T on his show to promote the first ever WrestleMania. To demonstrate a wrestling hold, Hogan placed Belzer in a front shinlock that instantly cut off blood flow. Belzer passed out within seconds, went limp, and collapsed headfirst onto the studio floor, splitting his head open on live television. He regained consciousness with blood pooling on the stage and later needed stitches.
See, it works. All right, brother.
And now, we'll be right back after this word from you-know-who. We'll be right back.
Belzer later sued Hogan and the WWF for $5 million but settled out of court, reportedly using the payout to buy a house he jokingly called Ches Hogan. In 1945, 12-year-old Paul Cusack was reported missing after going out to play near his home in Euclid, Ohio. The next morning, his father began searching nearby lots and made a horrific discovery in a storage yard used by a grain company. Paul had been accidentally buried alive beneath an avalanche of thousands of pounds of split peas after heavy sacks of them toppled over and collapsed on top of him while he was playing nearby.
Somebody screamed, "Call the police," and I said no, and I just fired the gun, and this big noise went off, and then I grabbed the phone and got the hell out of there. But I wasn't even in that room. I mean, it just was an explosion. I moved, they moved, the gun went off, and it was like, ah! And it was that fast.
That was Betty Broderick on the witness stand, describing how she shot her ex-husband and his new wife as they slept. On November 5, 1989, the 41-year-old broke into the San Diego home of renowned attorney Dan Broderick and fatally shot him and his wife Linda Kolkena in their bed before turning herself in the next morning. The killings followed a bitter years-long divorce, marked by accusations of infidelity, emotional abuse, and financial control. Betty had supported Dan through medical and law school, only to be discarded for his much younger assistant, who later became his wife. As the marriage unraveled, her behavior escalated, including vandalizing his home, ramming her car into his front door, and multiple psychiatric hospitalizations. Although Betty claimed she only meant to confront the couple, prosecutors played recorded calls in which she said she wished Dan would just die. She was ultimately convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years to life. In 2024, 17-year-old Sha Ray was the sole survivor of a family murder-suicide after police say his father killed his mother, his 11-year-old brother, and his 8 and 2-year-old sisters before turning the gun on himself. Sha Ray was found alive in the family garage with a gunshot wound to his head. He miraculously survived, but the injury left him permanently blind and facing lifelong medical complications. Despite the trauma and severe injuries, Sha Ray went on to enroll at the University of Utah in 2025, beginning his freshman year just months after losing his entire immediate family. Tragically, just 1 week after starting college, he passed away from natural causes. In 2015, 25-year-old Mina El Houari traveled all the way from France to Fez, Morocco, to meet an online boyfriend she'd been speaking to for months, booking herself into a luxury hotel before their first date. When they got together in the evening, Mina suddenly collapsed, slipping into what was later determined to be an undiagnosed diabetic coma. But instead of calling for medical help, the man panicked and assumed she was dead. He drove her to his home, dug a shallow grave in his backyard, and buried her alive while she was still breathing. Mina slowly suffocated underground, never regaining consciousness. When her family lost contact with her, they filed a missing persons report and flew to Morocco to search. Police questioning led them to the man's home, where muddy clothing and a shovel exposed the crime scene. He later confessed and was charged with involuntary manslaughter, turning a young woman's hopeful search for love into a real-life nightmare. In December of 2019, Anthony Topp murdered his wife Megan and their 3 young children along with the family dog inside their home in Celebration, Florida. Autopsies showed the victims were restrained, beaten, and suffocated, with evidence indicating the children were killed first. Topp then remained in the house for weeks as the bodies decomposed, sleeping nearby and conducting normal activities while masking the smells with air fresheners. When police entered the home a few weeks later, they found all 5 bodies in various stages of decomposition. Topp later admitted responsibility, though he gave conflicting accounts and attempted to blame his wife. In 2023, he was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and animal cruelty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. In November of 1998, 48-year-old Harold Brady used a church meeting to gain the trust of Chandelle Maycock and her 5-year-old daughter Quatisha before abducting them in Florida. He first drove Chandelle to an isolated sugar field, wrapped his hands around her throat, and strangled her until her body went limp. Believing she was dead, he left her lying alone in the field, but she later woke up severely injured and barely survived after flagging down a passing driver. Brady then took Quatisha deep into the Everglades and abandoned her alive near a canal locals refer to as Alligator Alley. Prosecutors say he left her there deliberately, believing the child could identify him. The 5-year-old was left alone in the dark wetlands, surrounded by predators, unable to escape or call for help. 2 days later, her body was recovered from the canal, with investigators concluding she was torn apart by alligators. Brady was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but decades later, changes to Florida's death penalty laws reopened his case. More than 25 years after the crime, prosecutors are now seeking his execution. This was the moment Icelandic singer Björk crashed out at Bangkok Airport in 1996, lunging at reporter Julie Kaufman and knocking her to the ground, moments after the reporter simply greeted her with the words, "Welcome to Bangkok." What appeared to be an explosive reaction to a harmless greeting was later explained by Björk as a breaking point. She claimed Kaufman had stalked her and her 9-year-old son for days across multiple locations, ignoring requests to stop. Björk said the airport encounter triggered fear for her child's safety. Kaufman denied any stalking, no charges were filed, and the footage became one of the most infamous celebrity confrontations of the 90s. On April 16, 2014, the South Korean ferry Sewol capsized and sank off the coast of Jindo while carrying 476 people, most of them high school students on a field trip. An abrupt turn combined with overloaded cargo caused the ship to list and rapidly flood. Passengers were repeatedly told over the intercom to stay where they were. Instructions most of them followed as water quickly filled the decks. The captain and several crew members abandoned ship early, leaving hundreds trapped inside. The ferry sunk in roughly 2 hours, killing 304 people, the majority of them teenagers. The captain was convicted of gross negligence and murder by omission and sentenced to life in prison, while multiple crew members and shipping company officials received prison terms.
Where are you? Probably don't have much time left. Just tell my mom that I love her if I die.
That was the voice of 16-year-old Kyle Plush, heard in his final moments as he slowly died alone in his family's minivan. In April of 2018, Kyle became trapped in a Honda Odyssey in his high school parking lot when the power-folding third-row seat suddenly collapsed, folding forward and pinning him upside down by the chest, neck, and head. The position left him inverted, compressing his lungs and restricting blood flow. For roughly 30 minutes, Kyle called 911 multiple times, calmly but increasingly distressed, telling dispatchers he was trapped and struggling to breathe.
Hello, Cincinnati 911. This is the address of the emergency. Cincinnati 911. The Seven Hills what parking lot?
As the pressure worsened, his voice grew weaker and more labored.
Where are you? Probably
don't have much time left to tell my mom that I love her if I die. This is not a joke. This is not a joke. I'm trapped inside my gold Honda Odyssey van in the Southport parking lot of 7 Hills Beth. Send officers immediately. I'm almost dead.
His calls were repeatedly misclassified as accidental butt dials, and officers sent to search for him checked the wrong area before leaving. Kyle remained trapped for hours, unable to move, eventually losing consciousness and dying from positional asphyxia. He was later found by his parents, still wedged beneath the folded seat. His death was ruled accidental, but the case exposed serious failures in emergency response and raised lasting concerns about vehicle seat designs and how narrowly Kyle missed being rescued. This was the moment skydiving student Christopher Jones suddenly went unconscious during what was supposed to be a routine training skydive in 2014. At around 9,000 feet, his body stiffened and began violently seizing in freefall, his head snapping back as he lost all control, tumbling through the air with no ability to deploy his parachute. Realizing what was happening, instructor Sheldon McFarland chased him down midair, fighting the wind and closing the distance with mere seconds to spare. McFarland eventually managed to grab Jones, stabilize his limp body, and pull his ripcord just in time, preventing a horrific fall that would have instantly been fatal. If you're a bad person who's afraid of heights, here's a sneak peek of what hell looks like. During a sudden storm at Six Flags Mexico in August of 2024, riders on the Sky Screamer swing ride found themselves trapped nearly 250 feet in the air as heavy rain and strong winds moved in. Instead of descending, the ride's automatic safety systems activated and locked the chairs in place, leaving passengers suspended high above the park with their legs dangling as powerful storms intensified around them. For roughly 10 minutes, riders were forced to remain exposed to the storm with no control over the situation, unsure of what would happen next or if the ride would be struck by lightning. Eventually, the ride was safely lowered once conditions stabilized and no physical injuries were reported. Here's an insane compilation of hospital patients playing instruments while surgeons operate directly on their brains. During certain brain surgeries, called awake craniotomies, patients are kept fully conscious while doctors remove tumors or treat severe epilepsy. The brain itself cannot feel pain, so surgeons can safely work while the patient is awake. Patients are asked to talk, sing, or play instruments during the operation, so doctors can map exactly which parts of the brain control speech, movement, and music. If the patient suddenly loses coordination or stops playing correctly, surgeons immediately know they're too close to an important area. In some cases, patients can hear the drilling and feel pressure but experience no pain. Some even have full conversations with the surgical team while their brain is exposed. This insane process allows doctors to remove as much of the tumor as possible while avoiding permanent damage to speech, memory, or motor function. So while it looks unreal, these patients are actually helping to guide their own brain surgery in real time. Here's a terrifying clip of a Ukrainian soldier showing symptoms of rabies. Throughout the video, he tries to drink water but physically can't. This reaction is called hydrophobia, one of the clearest signs that rabies has reached the brain. Rabies is one of the deadliest diseases known. If treated immediately after exposure before symptoms appear, it's almost always preventable. But once symptoms like difficulty swallowing, confusion, or agitation begin, the virus has already caused significant neurological damage. At this stage, survival is so rare that statistically, a person has a better chance of surviving a gunshot wound to the head than surviving symptomatic rabies. There's no proven cure, and death is usually inevitable once symptoms appear. This was the moment when a hang gliding instructor realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. In November of 2018 in Switzerland, American tourist Chris Gursky had just taken off on a tandem hang gliding flight when he and the instructor immediately noticed that Gursky was not attached to the safety harness at all. The instructor immediately attempted an emergency stop, but strong winds instead lifted the glider higher into the air, sending them soaring hundreds of feet above the ground. With no safety line and no way to land immediately, Gursky was left dangling with nothing securing him to the aircraft. He was forced to cling to the metal frame with his hands while also desperately gripping the instructor to avoid falling. For more than 2 minutes, Gursky held on for dear life as his arms visibly shook and his grip weakened, fully aware that giving in to the pain would mean certain death. The entire ordeal was captured on video as the instructor desperately fought the wind and steered toward an emergency landing. When they finally reached the ground, Gursky collapsed in pain and was later diagnosed with a fractured wrist and torn bicep from hanging on so tightly. Authorities ruled the accident a serious safety failure, fining the instructor and suspending his license, while the footage became a chilling reminder of how one small misstep turned a fun recreational flight into a life-threatening nightmare. In February of 2025, 22-year-old Daniel Waterman was left comatose after a violent interstate crash in Florida, leaving him with severe head and spinal injuries. After briefly regaining consciousness months later, he told investigators the crash was intentional, alleging that his pregnant girlfriend, 24-year-old Leah Mumby, deliberately drove the car into a tree during an argument, accelerating as he tried to escape and telling him, "I don't care what happens, you'll get what you deserve." Mumby initially said she did not remember what happened before the crash. Waterby died from his injuries in October of 2025, and prosecutors later upgraded her charges to vehicular homicide. In 1962, the United States detonated a nuclear warhead in space during the Starfish Prime test, exploding it about 250 miles above Earth. The blast was far more destructive than expected, knocking out or damaging multiple satellites, creating artificial radiation belts that lingered for years, and causing electrical failures as far away as Hawaii. The test proved that nuclear explosions in space were unpredictable and capable of long-term damage to both technology and Earth's near-space environment, effectively ending any further attempts once scientists realized the harm could not be controlled. Brian Egg vanished in August of 2018 after suddenly disappearing from his San Francisco home. Weeks later, police went to the house for a welfare check and discovered a hidden room concealed behind a fake wall. Inside was a single large fish tank containing Brian's body, decapitated and missing both hands. Investigators later determined he'd been murdered by his roommate after an argument over rent and drug money while the two were using cocaine. After killing him, the roommate cut off Brian's head and hands, hid the body in the aquarium, filled it with water to slow down the decomposition, and sealed the room behind a fake wall. The killer, named Jeffrey Francisco, then fled the state but was eventually tracked down and arrested. Although he was originally charged with murder and facing several decades in prison, Francisco was allowed to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter, which made him eligible for early parole. In 2021, after only serving about 7 years of a 15-year sentence, the killer was released, a decision that sparked outrage when the public learned he was free. This was the moment a mermaid performer was attacked by a Chinese sturgeon during a live aquarium show. The performer, Maria Zelenina, was swimming inside a tank at Xishuangbanna Primitive Forest Park when the massive fish lunged forward without warning and pulled her head into its jaws as spectators watched in horror. She fought free underwater and surfaced in visible distress with her goggles ripped off, suffering from facial bruising, swelling around her eye, and lingering pain that affected her vision, later requiring medical treatment. While there are no confirmed cases of a sturgeon killing a human, the species can grow over 10 feet long, weighs hundreds of pounds, and has powerful jaws capable of crushing bone, meaning a sustained bite or loss of air underwater could easily be fatal. Here's a clip showing the importance of being aware of your surroundings at all times. In the video, a family is unloading their car in what many commenters believe to be a South American country like Argentina. Before going inside, the woman immediately senses something is wrong when a car pulls up directly in front of her. Without hesitation, she runs inside and locks the door just seconds before the men can reach the house. With no access to the home, the men quickly grab items from the family's car, get back in their vehicle, and speed off. In 2022, in Rockdale, England, police were searching for 18-year-old Joshua Dobson, who was wanted for stealing a car, driving while disqualified, and failing to pay for fuel. When police arrived at his home to arrest him, they found no sign of him, but they noticed a giant teddy bear sitting in the room that appeared to be subtly moving as if it were breathing. Suspicious, police approached the stuffed animal and discovered Dobson hiding inside of it, having cut it open and climbed inside in an attempt to evade capture. He was immediately arrested at the scene and later sentenced to 9 months in prison for the offenses. In 2023, 44-year-old Shikundi Tati of Maryland was arrested after police say he disguised himself as a woman to gain access to women's locker rooms at various gyms across the region. Investigators allege he secretly recorded women while they showered, using the disguise to avoid suspicion. The case came to light after gym members reported consistent suspicious behavior, leading to an investigation that uncovered the hidden recordings and led to his arrest. This footage shows former Nazi concentration camp guard Joseph Schutz covering his face as he arrived at a German courtroom in 2022. At 101 years old, Schutz became the oldest person ever tried and convicted for Holocaust-era crimes. Prosecutors argued that while serving as an SS guard at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp between 1942 and 1945, he knowingly assisted in the systematic murder of at least 3,500 prisoners. Schutz claimed he did absolutely nothing wrong and was not aware of the gruesome crimes being carried out at the camp. He was convicted as an accessory to murder and sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he remained free while appealing the verdict. Schutz died in April of 2023 before serving his sentence. Angie Barlow, a British woman with a severe fear of dentists, avoided professional dental care for roughly a decade by repeatedly supergluing loose or fallen teeth back into her mouth. Instead of fixing the underlying decay and gum disease, the glue trapped bacteria beneath the teeth and caused progressive infections. Over time, the damage became catastrophic, with dentists later finding that up to 90% of the bones supporting her upper teeth had been destroyed. By the time she finally sought treatment, 11 teeth had to be removed, much of her jawbone had deteriorated, and she required extensive reconstructive surgery and dental implants to restore basic oral function. Here's a photo of American soldier Joseph Dwyer carrying a wounded Iraqi boy away from crossfire during the Iraq War in 2003, an image that became a symbol of compassion amid chaos. After returning home, Dwyer was diagnosed with severe PTSD, became unemployed, and suffered a marital breakdown as his mental health deteriorated into paranoia and violent delusions. In 2008, after years of psychological struggle and substance abuse, Joseph Dwyer died from a drug overdose, a quiet end to a life permanently altered by the horrors of war. In 2025, 15-year-old woodworking apprentice Muhammad Kendirsi died after coworkers assaulted him with a high-pressure air hose during what they reportedly called a workplace prank. The force of the compressed air caused massive internal damage, including rupturing of his intestines and severe internal bleeding. Doctors said the sudden air pressure led to rapid organ failure and shock, and despite emergency treatment, his injuries were too extensive for him to be saved. Authorities treated the incident as a violent assault, and the case sparked massive outrage over deadly hazing and abuse in the workplace. Austin Chumley Russell is best known as the laid-back fan favorite on Pawn Stars, but his life briefly veered off course in 2016 when police raided his Las Vegas home during a sexual assault investigation. The SA allegations were later dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the search uncovered a loaded firearm along with methamphetamine, marijuana, and Xanax. Chum was arrested and later pleaded guilty to a felony weapons charge and a misdemeanor drug charge, receiving probation, counseling, and rehab instead of prison time. He later cleaned up his life, lost 150 pounds, stayed on the show, and has spoken openly about focusing on his health and sobriety afterward. In 2010, an undercover journalist working for the dissident outlet Asia Press smuggled out rare footage from North Korea showing a severely malnourished 23-year-old homeless woman who said she survived by eating grass. Her voice was so weak that the reporter couldn't clearly record her name, and her identity has never been verified. Months later, local contacts reported she was found dead in a nearby cornfield, believed to have collapsed from starvation while desperately trying to eat raw corn. North Korea's state media never acknowledged the footage, but defectors reported heightened surveillance and crackdowns in the area afterward, with anyone suspected of leaking information facing severe punishment. Amu Haji, an Iranian hermit dubbed the dirtiest man in the world, avoided bathing for nearly 60 years because he believed cleanliness would make him sick. He lived this way into his 90s, smoking animal dung, eating roadkill, sleeping on the ground, and rarely interacting with others. Then in 2022, villagers finally convinced him to bathe for the first time in decades. Just a few weeks afterward, Haji fell severely ill and died at age 94. Matthew Day Merritt was born without legs and learned to walk on his hands from early childhood. As a young boy, his small size and unusual movements led filmmakers to place him inside the E.T. suit for the movie, where his hand walking gave the alien its unsettling, otherworldly motion. In October of 2018, 53-year-old Allison Gibson became trapped in her own bathtub after sitting down to bathe and realizing she could no longer reach the grab bar she would normally pull herself up with. Alone in her home, she remained stuck for 5 days, surviving without food by drinking water directly from the tap. As time passed, she weakened and struggled with exhaustion, alternating the water between hot and cold to stay conscious and hydrated. From October 15th to the 19th, no one noticed she was missing until a mail carrier saw her mail piling up and alerted neighbors. Police were called and she was finally rescued, having narrowly avoided death from dehydration, hypothermia, or exhaustion after nearly a week immobilized in her own bathtub. This is the facial reconstruction created from a severed human head found in an Illinois park in 1993, the only clue investigators had for nearly 3 decades. The victim remained unidentified until 2022, when DNA genealogy revealed she was Susan Lund, who disappeared on Christmas Eve in 1992 after walking to a nearby store. Despite finally learning her name almost 30 years later, the rest of her body was never recovered. No suspect was ever charged, and her murder remains unsolved. This is a decorative tower filled with thousands of shaved human jawbone fragments, removed from patients during cosmetic jaw reduction surgeries in South Korea. The display came from a Seoul plastic surgery clinic, where the surgeon stacked discarded pieces of patients' faces into stacked columns to represent how many operations he had performed. The towers sparked public backlash and were later removed after authorities fined the clinic for violating medical waste laws requiring human remains to be incinerated. The case became a disturbing symbol of how normalized extreme facial alteration has become in South Korea, to the point that many patients have even reported being questioned at border control because their faces no longer match their passport photos. This disturbing footage shows a former University of South Florida PhD chemistry student secretly poisoning his neighbor's home during a dispute over noise. In 2023, Xu Ming Lee was caught on a neighbor's security cam repeatedly entering the hallway of their apartment building and injecting liquid opioids into a family's front door and into their door frame. Soon afterward, the family inside began suffering from unexplained vomiting, severe dizziness, headaches, and breathing problems. Police later determined Lee had been targeting them because of an ongoing argument over noise. Investigators said he used his chemistry background to introduce the drugs into their home without them knowing. Lee was arrested, expelled from the university, and later deported from the United States. On March 11, 2011, as the Tohoku earthquake struck Japan, 24-year-old city employee Miki Endo stayed at her post broadcasting emergency warnings about the incoming tsunami. Over loudspeakers across the town, she repeatedly urged residents to seek higher ground, continuing even as floodwaters began rushing into the streets and into her building. She refused to leave her position and kept warning the public until the tsunami completely submerged her office building. Miki didn't survive, but her final broadcasts are credited with helping to save thousands of lives. This little girl was diagnosed with dementia before she even turned 4. When Sophia Scott was 3 years old, her parents noticed her speaking and development were going backwards. The day before her 4th birthday, doctors told her family she had Sanfilippo syndrome, a rare genetic disease that prevents the body from breaking down certain sugars, causing them to build up in the brain and slowly destroy the nervous system. They were told there was no treatment and that she was unlikely to survive past her teenage years. Sophia developed mostly normally at first, but around age 6 she began to decline. Over time, she lost her speech, memory, and her ability to walk and care for herself. She later developed seizures, sleep apnea, scoliosis, bowel problems, and more than 30 different symptoms. Sanfilippo syndrome is often called childhood Alzheimer's, and most children begin showing symptoms between ages 1 and 4, usually dying in their teens. Now 15 years old, Sophia has lost much of her abilities. Her family continues searching for experimental treatment, but doctors believe it may be too late to reverse the damage. In the final stages of this disease, the brain forgets how to control basic functions like swallowing and breathing, and most patients die from complications such as pneumonia, respiratory failure, or cardiac arrest. A terminally ill boy who loved horror movies found real comfort when a Jason Voorhees cosplayer visited him, giving him a rare moment of joy during some of his darkest days and proving that villains can be heroes too. After being knocked unconscious by a car, disabled British Navy veteran Alan Parton was saved by his service dog Endel. Without commands, Endel dragged him into the recovery position, retrieved his phone from under the vehicle, covered him with a blanket, and ran to a nearby hospital to get help. Endel later received the PDSA Gold Medal for animal bravery. Matthew Stanford Robinson was born in 1988 in Salt Lake City, Utah. At birth, he suffered a severe lack of oxygen that left him blind, mostly paralyzed, and expected to live for only a few hours. But miraculously, he lived 10.5 years, passing in February of 1999. In his memory, his father designed a unique headstone that shows Matthew rising out of his wheelchair with his arm reaching upward, a tribute to his spirit and a symbol of hope and freedom to those with disabilities. This was the moment a man attempted to rob a small loans office in Kazakhstan, smashing through thin laminated safety glass at the receptionist's window. He then quickly climbed inside, grabbed the female clerk, and threatened her with a knife to force her cooperation. He stole about $340 before fleeing, but police arrested him later that same day. Authorities confirmed he was eventually prosecuted and ultimately sentenced to 7 years in prison for the robbery, while the clerk managed to escape unharmed. This person looked over the balcony of their high-rise apartment building to realize they owned a cat, not a pussy. Here's a clip of a man trapped inside a grain silo with thousands of pounds of grain pressing in from every direction. What makes this situation so horrifying is that grain doesn't behave like a solid. Once it starts moving, it flows like liquid, pulling a person under like quicksand. Within seconds, someone can be buried up to their chest, and struggling only makes it worse. By this point, self-rescue is nearly impossible. The pressure restricts breathing, and panic speeds up suffocation. The only real chance of survival is to stop moving and hold a small pocket of air around your face, keeping your head above the grain until rescuers arrive. Accordingly, dozens of farmers die every year in this exact way due to grain entrapment. At the height of her Disney fame, Ashley Tisdale was battling serious health and mental struggles. Since childhood, she had suffered from severe anxiety and panic attacks, and during her High School Musical years, they became so intense that she was repeatedly rushed to hospitals believing she was having heart attacks until doctors realized it was panic. The stress left her barely eating and constantly exhausted. In 2007, at 21 years old, months of unexplained pain led doctors to discover a tumor in her breast that required surgery, later confirmed to be benign. Years later, she revealed she developed alopecia, causing patches of her hair to fall out from stress and autoimmune issues, saying the pressure to appear fine through the years came at a real cost to her health. In January of 2026 in Pennsylvania, 11-year-old Clayton Dietz fatally shot his adoptive father, Douglas Dietz, on the night of the boy's own birthday after his Nintendo Switch was taken away from him. Police say the child waited until his father fell asleep on the couch, found the key to his gun safe, loaded a handgun, and shot him once in the head. The boy later admitted he did it out of anger over losing his game console. Douglas Dietz died at the scene, while prosecutors charged the boy with criminal homicide and moved to try him as an adult, calling the case one of the most disturbing juvenile killings in recent years. During King Leopold II's personal rule over the Congo Free State, forced labor and terror were used to extract rubber for profit. When workers failed to meet rubber quotas, punishment was systematic and brutal, with hands or entire limbs cut off as a warning. Soldiers often mutilated or killed the workers' wives and children as well, using family terror to force compliance from entire families. The regime led to the deaths of millions through execution, starvation, disease, and torture, making it one of the most horrific colonial atrocities in history. In 2004, a massive fire broke out at the Yacuwa Bolaños supermarket in Paraguay during a busy shopping day. As smoke and flames spread, multiple exits were reportedly locked to prevent customers from fleeing with unpaid merchandise, trapping hundreds of people inside. The fire ended up killing more than 400 people, many from smoke inhalation while pressed against sealed doors. Investigators later confirmed severe safety violations, and several owners and employees were convicted, making it one of the deadliest fires in history and a stark example of profit being prioritized over human life. This was the moment a couple of Christian extremists realized their lives were over, as courtroom footage shows Seth Welch and Tatiana Fusari standing at their arraignment after their 10-month-old daughter Mary died from severe malnutrition and dehydration caused by prolonged neglect. Prosecutors revealed the infant weighed just 8 pounds at the time of her death and showed signs of extreme starvation after being deprived of adequate food, water, and medical care for weeks. The medical examiner ruled her death entirely preventable, ruling she died from starvation rather than illness. The parents later claimed extreme isolated religious beliefs led them to reject modern medical care and even attempted to use those beliefs as a defense in court. In 2019, Seth Welch was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for first-degree felony murder, while his wife Tatiana also received life in prison but with the possibility of parole. The judge said their actions showed an utter disregard for human life, ruling that religious belief does not excuse starving a child to death. A 5-year-old kindergartner in Standish, Maine was recently killed after his arm became trapped in the closing doors of his school bus as it pulled away from his morning stop, leaving him pinned to the vehicle and dragged nearly 300 feet along the pavement. Investigators determined the driver was unaware the child was caught and continued driving until other motorists began frantically signaling that something was wrong. The child eventually lost his grip, fell into the roadway, and was run over by the same bus, suffering catastrophic injuries and dying at the scene. The bus driver, a 64-year-old woman, was placed on administrative leave and no charges were filed. The tragic death was ruled accidental, but the case triggered an investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board after it was confirmed the bus's door systems failed to detect the child before the vehicle moved, raising concerns about blind spots, sensor limitations, and school bus loading zone safety. Here's a photo of a 71-year-old man in profound distress outside a burning residential complex in Hong Kong on November 26, 2025, after telling reporters his wife was trapped inside as smoke and flames engulfed the high-rise towers. The blaze began in the afternoon at a nearby housing estate and quickly spread through bamboo scaffolding and flammable renovation materials, consuming 7 of the 8 apartment blocks and sending dark plumes of smoke into the sky. Authorities later confirmed the fire became one of the deadliest residential blazes in Hong Kong history, with the final official death toll reaching 168 people, including a firefighter. In 2003, at the Toledo Hospital in Ohio, a man named Paul Fudach Jr. donated one of his kidneys to save the life of his sister, Sarah. Surgeons successfully removed the healthy organ and placed it in a sterile container as they prepared for the transplant. But while it sat unattended outside the operating room, a nurse found the container, did not realize it held a donated human kidney, and mistakenly threw the $250,000 organ into a medical waste bin. By the time the error was discovered, the kidney had been contaminated and had to be destroyed. Paul had undergone major surgery for nothing, and Sarah lost her chance at a life-saving transplant. She did finally receive a donor kidney months later as the hospital admitted fault, paid a settlement, and rewrote the organ handling procedures after the incident. Renowned actress Natalie Wood died in November of 1981 at age 43 after drowning off the coast of California during a weekend boat trip with her husband Robert Wagner and co-star Christopher Walken. She had gone missing from their yacht Splendor sometime during the night and was later found floating in the water wearing a nightgown, socks, and a down jacket. The initial investigation ruled her death an accidental drowning, suggesting she had slipped while trying to secure a loose dinghy, despite Wood's well-known fear of dark water and inability to swim. An autopsy revealed bruises on her body and the presence of alcohol and pain medication, raising questions about whether she was impaired or injured before entering the water. Conflicting accounts from Wagner and Walken, reports of a heated argument earlier that night, and later statements from the boat's captain alleging Wagner delayed calling for help fueled decades of suspicion. 30 years later, in 2011, authorities officially reopened the case, and in 2012, Wood's death certificate was amended to drowning and other undetermined factors. In 2018, Wagner was named a person of interest, though no official charges have ever been filed, leaving one of Hollywood's most infamous deaths officially unresolved. Here's some extremely rare footage of a giant squid feeding on a much smaller squid. For centuries, giant squid were dismissed as pure myth, nothing more than sailor legends like the Kraken. Their existence wasn't even scientifically accepted until 1857, and humans didn't film one alive in the deep sea until 2012. Even today, they remain among the least observed large animals on Earth. They live thousands of feet below the surface in near total darkness, and almost no one in history has ever seen one actively hunting, let alone captured it on video. Here's an extremely rare compilation of wild animals shedding their antlers. Antlers are one of the fastest growing bones in the animal kingdom, and unlike horns, they're designed to fall off and regrow every year. While antlers are growing, they're covered in a soft, blood-rich skin called velvet that supplies oxygen and nutrients to the developing bone. Once the antlers reach full size, rising testosterone levels cut off that blood supply, the velvet dies, and the animal rubs it off against trees and brush to expose the hardened bone beneath. After mating season ends, hormone levels drop again, the bone weakens at the base, and the entire antler eventually detaches and breaks away. This cycle allows deer, elk, and moose to grow a completely new set of antlers each year, often larger than the last. In November of 2022, 7-year-old Athena Strand was struck by a FedEx delivery van while playing in her Texas driveway, but she survived the impact with only minor injuries. But instead of calling for help, the driver, 31-year-old Tanner Lynn Horner, panicked after Athena said she was going to tell her father, took her inside his van, and murdered her. Court documents state he first tried to break her neck, and when that failed, strangled her with his bare hands while she was still alive. He then drove around for hours and dumped her body near the Trinity River, returning to work as if nothing had happened. Athena's disappearance sparked a massive search, and her body was found 2 days later after Horner confessed and led police to the location. He was charged with capital murder and kidnapping, with prosecutors seeking the harshest possible sentence. In November of 1998, 48-year-old Harold Brady used a church meeting to gain the trust of Chandel Maycock and her 5-year-old daughter Quatisha before abducting them in Florida. He first drove Chandel to an isolated sugar field, wrapped his hands around her throat, and strangled her until her body went limp. Believing she was dead, dead, he left her lying alone in the field, but she later woke up severely injured and barely survived after flagging down a passing driver. Brady then took Quatisha deep into the Everglades and abandoned her alive near a canal locals refer to as Alligator Alley. Prosecutors say he left her there deliberately, believing the child could identify him. The 5-year-old was left alone in the dark wetlands, surrounded by predators, unable to escape or call for help. 2 days later, her body was recovered from the canal, with investigators concluding she was torn apart by alligators. Brady was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but decades later, changes to Florida's death penalty laws reopened his case. More than 25 years after the crime, prosecutors are now seeking his execution. This was the moment a normal day at a busy restaurant nearly turned into a child abduction. Without warning, a man later identified as Nassim Slamang vaulted over a railing and grabbed a young girl by the neck as she sat with her family, attempting to pull her away in front of stunned onlookers. But before he could escape, restaurant owner Dishal Suku, a trained jiu-jitsu black belt, rushed in, tackled the suspect to the ground, and restrained him until police arrived. Slamang was arrested and later prosecuted for the attempted kidnapping, while the family was left shaken by how close the child came to vanishing within seconds. This is exactly why you should always test the waters before swimming in the streets of Thailand after a massive flood. Severe flooding hit Thailand in November of 2025 after days of heavy rain, with water rising more than 20 feet in some areas and swallowing entire neighborhoods within hours. The floods came so fast that many residents were trapped without food for days, and more than 100 people were reported killed across the region. As water displaced wildlife and habitats, massive snakes, including pythons, were seen swimming through streets and entering homes seeking higher ground alongside terrified residents. In October of 2024 in Arizona, 9-year-old Rebecca Baptiste escaped her home by jumping out a second-story apartment window and running to a nearby gas station, where she begged strangers for help and said she was being abused by her father and his girlfriend. Police and child welfare authorities were notified, and hospital staff documented visible injuries, but officers ultimately downplayed her claims and returned her to her abusers. Over the following months, the abuse escalated until July of 2025, when Rebecca was found unresponsive along a rural highway and later died from non-accidental trauma. An autopsy revealed extreme malnourishment, extensive bruising, burns, hair loss, and other injuries consistent with prolonged torture. Her father, Richard Baptiste, and his girlfriend, Anisha Woods, were arrested and charged with murder and severe child abuse, as the case became a stark example of how a child's desperate pleas for help were ignored with fatal consequences. This was the moment an Indonesian conservationist broke down in tears after finally witnessing one of the rarest flowers on Earth bloom. After searching the rainforests of Sumatra for 13 years, Diki Andriki and his team found a Rafflesia, a parasitic flower often nicknamed a corpse flower because it releases a powerful odor of rotting flesh to attract insects. The plant spends most of its life hidden inside a host vine and only blooms for a few days, making sightings incredibly rare as researchers never even see one in their lifetime. When the massive, foul-smelling flower began to open in front of him, the weight of more than a decade of dangerous jungle expeditions and failed searches finally hit. This is one of the rarest atmospheric events ever caught on video. Upward lightning erupting from the summit of Volcán de Agua in Guatemala. The bolts appear to tear straight out of the volcano, making it look less like weather and more like something unnatural unfolding in real time. Unlike normal lightning that strikes downward from clouds, this phenomenon shoots upward from the ground into the storm above, triggered by intense electrical imbalance. It's so uncommon that storm chasers never even see it once in their lifetime, and it's almost never captured this clearly over a populated city. Lacy Fletcher was a 36-year-old woman from Slaughter, Louisiana, who was found dead in January of 2022 after years of being left to rot on a couch in her parents' home. She suffered from severe autism and was reportedly nonverbal. When authorities arrived, Lacy's body was fused to the sofa, surrounded by years of human waste, insects, and mold. She only weighed about 96 pounds, had bed sores at exposed bone, and was covered in feces and maggots. Coroners ruled her death a homicide caused by severe neglect, starvation, and untreated medical conditions. Investigators determined she had likely been left in the same position for at least 12 years, slowly melting into the sofa while her parents lived in the house with her. Despite the horrific condition of her body and the prolonged suffering, her parents were initially charged with second-degree murder, but the charges were later reduced and ultimately dismissed by a judge in 2024, since the judge ruled that prosecutors couldn't prove that Lacy's parents intended to kill her or knowingly caused her death, triggering widespread public outrage over how such prolonged extreme neglect could result in no prison sentence. This woman's life has been changed forever by a random horrific attack that lasted only a few seconds. 46-year-old Ashley Wazel Wazalewski was suddenly attacked without warning while walking near Forsyth Park in Savannah, Georgia, after attending a Christmas program at a nearby church on December 10, 2025. A stranger had approached her from behind and poured a corrosive chemical directly over her head, causing immediate catastrophic burns. The liquid ate through her clothing, burned deep into her skin, and was so caustic it melted a key fob in her pocket as it spread across her body. She suffered second and third degree burns over more than half her body, including her face and scalp, and began screaming as her clothes started burning off her skin. The attacker didn't take anything from her and simply fled the scene within seconds. A good Samaritan rushed in to help as she wailed in agony and called her family. Wazalewski was quickly transferred to the Augusta Burn Center, where doctors say recovery will involve prolonged hospitalization, multiple surgeries, and permanent scarring. As of the latest updates, the attacker has not yet been identified or arrested.